Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Ashali. I am the Managing Director of Transitions Research's People's Urban Living Lab, and I'll be moderating this dialogue, Can We Survive and Thrive in Hot Cities? Across South Asia, especially in India, our cities are sweltering this summer. Over the last few weeks, we've experienced unprecedented heat. The capital city of Delhi has reported temperatures of 52.9 degrees centigrade. And over the last few weeks, about 37 cities have reported temperatures above 45 degrees. And this kind of heat can be devastating. It impacts our health and our well-being. It impacts the economy and our ability to be productive. And that's especially important in a country where close to 20% of the non-farm workers are employed outdoors. It impacts our ability to access basic services. For example, when schools close and children can no longer safely go to school because it is just too hot. And it also impacts our ability to tackle climate change and combat rising greenhouse gas emissions. Because when it's so hot, a lot of us who can afford to turn our air conditioners on, and that contributes to consuming more energy and more greenhouse gas emissions that just continue to cause warming, and the cycle is kind of stuck. And a recent study published in India by IIT Bhubaneswar finds that rapid urbanization and poor planning contribute to a 60% increase in warming in Indian cities, right? So as India's urban population surges, the time is now. We urgently need to find sustainable, accessible, and affordable cooling solutions to combat heat. So I'm extremely excited that over the next hour, we'll be in conversation with three exceptional panelists who are tackling extreme heat in cities around the world. So with that, I'd like to kick off our dialogue, Can We Survive and Thrive in Hotter Cities, with an round of introduction to our panelists. But I'd also like to inform all of our participants that we are saving some time at the end of the conversation for Q&A. So hopefully all of you see a Q&A box at the bottom, and you can type in your questions through the conversation. You can target them to specific panelists if you'd like, and we'll get to them later in the session. So thanks everyone for joining. Alphabetically, first we have Aditya. He is the Fellow and Coordinator for Adaptation and Resilience at the Sustainable Future Collaborative. He conducts research on climate adaptation with a focus on strengthening policies to combat extreme. Next, we have Bushra. She is the Chief Heat Officer for North Dhaka in Bangladesh. Appointed by the Arsh Rock Foundation, her role has been established in response to the city's pressing heat challenges. In her capacity, she is leading heat adaptive solutions in collaboration and partnership with various stakeholders within and beyond the city. And finally, we have Owen. Owen is the Deputy Director at the Atlantic Council Adrian Arsh Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center, Arsh Rock, where he manages the HEAT initiative. He joined the Arsh Rock team in early 2020 and led the development of Arsh Rock's Heat Action Platform and supported the launch of the Extreme Heat Resilience Alliance and Arsh Rock's Heat Health Early Warning System Initiative. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I know y'all are all doing really exciting work across the world in cities on combating heat. So maybe we could start it off with a quick question for all of you. If you could take 2 minutes and tell us a little bit about what you're working on to address extreme heat in cities, especially in the context of the Global South. And Owen, Global South, I think, really is targeted to you because Anthea and Bushra are working directly. So I would say, why don't we kick it off with a question for all of you to learn a little bit more about your work. And I was asking if you could tell us a bit about what you're doing to address extreme heat in cities, especially in the context of the Global South. And Owen, that Global South context is particularly for you, considering Bushra and Aditya are directly working in cities here. So would you mind starting it off, Owen? Just telling us a little bit about your work for 2 minutes?
Owen, you're muted.
Thanks, Bushra. So thank you for that introduction. Sharing a bit more about the Arsh Rock Resilience Center. We're a DC-based organization working internationally on heat adaptation. And a lot of what we do is we test new approaches to heat adaptation with local partners and then work to scale them. And so a few areas we work across are in heat planning, heat governance, and also innovative finance, which I'll share a bit more about. A few things that we're doing right now includes testing parametric insurance for developing planning resources for cities, and also partnering with a network of chief heat officers, including Bushra across Dhaka North, across Freetown, Sierra Leone, Santiago, Chile, and Monterrey, Mexico. And so our STROC is in the end DC based, that we work with kind of a group of stakeholders across various countries, and those chief heat officers are a really important part of that. And I'm going to look to Bushra to share more about her experience and the amazing work she's doing in Dhaka North. One example, just to share a bit about what we're doing, is in Ahmedabad last summer, we partnered with the Self-Employed Women's Association and an insurtech called Blue Marble to develop a parametric insurance product covering 21,000 women members of SEWA. And this included the insurance product itself, but it also included wraparound services, water coolers, tarps to immediately reduce heat's effects. And then there was an element of financial inclusion as well, and connecting women with bank accounts. And so a lot of the work that we're doing, I would say, across in this network of chief heat officers, is focused in India, between Ahmedabad and another project in Chennai, India, where we worked with the Chennai Resilience Center to test the use of mobile garden kits. One is a food security measure, but also as a heat reduction measure when you put these mobile garden kits on rooftops to see if you can lower indoor temperatures in the top floor of a building. And so those are just a couple of examples of projects that I'm happy to dive into a bit later in the webinar, but I'll pass back to you, Ashali.
Thanks, Owen. That's fascinating, and I'm excited to learn more. But considering you talked a little bit about innovation in governance, and you mentioned the chief heat officers, maybe Bushra, you could go next and just tell us a little bit about your role and what you do in Dhaka.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Ashali, and thank you, Owen. Yeah, I'm Bushra Afriin. I'm the Chief Heat Officer working in Dhaka North, and it's been an extremely challenging year. We have realized that heat is a very complex issue that's spanning across so many different sectors, and then there's challenges within those sectors that. Sorry? Oh. I thought Aditya was talking to me. And then there are challenges within those sectors themselves that are exacerbated when in the context of heat. So kind of taking a very, and also we are dealing with a lot of inequality when it comes to wealth, when it comes to education, when it comes to access to healthcare, access to cooling. There's not just economic inequity, but there's also cultural and social inequity. It's harder for women to cool down in Dhaka than in other places. We have a lot of sociocultural and socioeconomic issues that really add to women's burdens during heat waves. And we are seeing a lot of decreases in productivity, as well as increased burdens on vulnerable populations when it comes to extra costs of healthcare and doctor's fees when family members get sick, and there's no social protection. So we are it's like one issue to the next. It's everything. Heat is affecting everything, whether it's infrastructure or education or health, or it's just everywhere. And I urge everyone to take it very seriously, because it wasn't taken seriously just a year ago. And but now I'm grateful that the tides are turning and everyone's really talking about it, which is a huge shift from why do we need to look at this at all, to we need to look at this, and now it's like, how do we look at this, how do we invest in it, there's a lot of conversation about locally led adaptation, but we still have to get that translated into action. But that is what is missing. And also figuring out a way to coordinate stakeholders, because there's a lot of them. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Bushra. I'm excited to learn more, especially about the work you're doing on unique vulnerabilities for women and girls, and dive a bit deeper into that. So before we do, though, Aditya, would you like to tell us a little bit about your work?
Oh, yeah, thanks for that, Ashali. It's almost like I'm muted when I want to talk, unmuted when I don't want to be heard. Sorry for interrupting you, Bushra. I was trying to test my speakers. Clearly, they work. So the work we do in India. So I work in a think tank called the Sustainable Futures Collaborative. And we have an adaptation resilience practice that focuses in large parts on heat and mitigating long-term heat risks. And I mean, I think it might be useful to just, paint a little bit of context and tell you how we approach this problem of heat, right? I mean, there are a couple of factors that drive our thinking and how we select problems and think about solutions. One of the big ones is that, according to some estimates, about 75% of India's working population is heat exposed. And that's a massive number. It's about 300 million people, right? So if you build a protective net, you're thinking about building it for 300 plus million people. And that just gives you a scale, gives you the scale of the problem, but it's also an invisible threat and it affects different places differently. So that adds another layer of complexity, right? The second thing, and this is, Ashali, coming to your prompt about the global south, India exhibits urbanization patterns that are pretty common across large swathes of the global south, in which there is a sort of relentless rural to urban migration, and because of the way capital is structured, cities become productivity and productivity hubs and engines of growth. And so that is vexing from a climate perspective, because not only are cities the sort of focal point for emissions, they're also hugely climate vulnerable, right? The third thing is that India has a relatively weak social safety net. And this, when combined with relatively poor investments in education and healthcare, leads to pretty high levels of vulnerability. This varies from state to state in India, because India is a large, complex federal structure, but in general, the trend lines point to increasing vulnerability over time. And the final part, and this is the part that we've decided to tackle, is about local governance capacity. And in our conversations with local government officials across the country, we found two things. One is that there's relatively low levels of awareness, and two, there's very little money in the system. So they don't know what the problem is, they don't know what the solutions are, and they don't have money to tackle it, right? So the awareness bit is not something we have a comparative advantage in. We talk about solutions every once in a while, but what we've been working on mostly is finance, and I can talk about that a little bit later. But this is a problem in our assessment. We've looked at financing for heat in multiple countries, and Owen and Bushra can talk about this more from the vantage point of their work. But this is a global massive investments in infrastructure. Is future heat, in the sense that the solutions we're building today are not going to be fit for purpose tomorrow. So we need to be building stuff for tomorrow now, which is even more complicated given all the challenges I just highlighted, right? So that's kind of what we're working on now. We have a bunch of work on finance and a bunch of work on preparing for future heat. These are the two sort of broad areas.
Thanks, Aditya. I empathize with a lot of what you were saying. We're doing, as part of our Urban Living Lab, we're working on climate solutions in small, mid-sized Indian cities, those that are rapidly growing. There's a lot of potential to shape the built environment and future growth. And I definitely agree that there's a lot of limited awareness about climate change, the impacts, and how to build and incorporate solutions within day-to-day workflows. Right? People are already at capacity. So I look forward to learning a little bit more about what you're doing in that regard. But I'd like to get a little bit deeper into the conversations, picking up on the themes that all of you have mentioned. And maybe, Bushra, I can start with you, specifically around the idea of vulnerability and the work that you're doing with women, right? You said specifically that women in Dhaka have a harder time coping and adapting to heat than in other places and as compared to other populations. Your work is focused on vulnerable communities. So I'd love to learn a little bit more about your experience. How did you identify these challenges, right? How did you figure out how heat impacts them uniquely, what their vulnerabilities are, and how could you work to co-create solutions with them that really benefit them and address their challenges?
Right. So 38% of the population in Dhaka live in informal settlements. That's more than 4 million people, half of whom are women and children. And we knowing that these are, I've grown up in the city, we've always known that these places have it hard. But that's an understatement, because once you actually go in there as a policymaker or as somebody who, as a decision maker or somebody with some level of authority and power, you really come face to face with the challenges that they're facing on a daily level, whether it's no guaranteed access to whether or not they will have water, or whether that water will be cool enough so that they can take a shower when it gets too hot, or whether they can cook at the time when they need to cook, because their food have been spoiled by lack of electricity to refrigeration. Whether they are able to sleep at night because there's no power at night when they've come home, working all day long, and even during the day it's really hot, but because of the way their houses are built with lower ceilings, metal huts, a lot of the huts that you get are like, now it's a bit improved. Like before it used to be like fully metal, but now some of it is concrete, but even then it absorbs a lot of heat because the ceilings are so low and there's very poor ventilation. So I mean, the houses are all packed together, so there's barely any wind coming in. Also, they have a lot of problems when it comes to waterlogging. So these places are usually built on top of lakes, and whenever it rains, the water just rises like crazy, as opposed to other places. So heat was never kind of they have a lot of other problems that they're dealing with on an everyday basis. And heat, it doesn't really damage property, but when they have limited property, like maybe they have clothes and mattresses and things on the ground, and the water comes up and it gets ruined. So floods and waterlogging were the primary concern in these areas, but recently it has been heat, because they've not been able to get any sleep, they've not been able to cool down, they've not had access to any sort of anybody coming in, that has happened for floods and other cyclones and other issues and other disasters. But heat has never been something that the local government had ever talked to them about. So, NGOs maybe, or academical institutions, sure, but used as a voter base without any action on heat. So last year, when I went and visited these communities, it was like there was a lot of anger that we are not able to sleep. We can't sleep at night. And when I asked about, okay, well, and also there's lack of data in these places, right? You don't know how many people have died. You don't know how many, there's no comorbidity studies that have taken place in these areas where, like during heat, how many people have had heart failure, or how many people have had liver issues or kidney issues. So there's still a lot of lacking in these, and the community is not sensitized to the factor of comorbidity. They don't know that, oh, heat caused my husband to behave really angrily with me, or heat caused, my father to die, or, people still haven't connected those issues. And so when we went in there, we were like, it was a lot to take in, because you don't want to be the person coming in and saying like, hey, heat is also very fatal. You have to be careful. And it's just another thing you have to worry about now, without giving them some sort of solution, without saying that this is how we are working on it, this is how we want to work with you. So what we did is we started having these conversations about trees, about the fact that they don't have like tree inequity is a very real thing. And right on the other side of these slums are luscious areas that are for wealthier, households. And so we went in there to do some tree planting projects, and we planted over 5,500 trees in over 15 settlements. And some areas received large quantities because they just had more space, and some received fewer quantities because it was entirely built up. There was no soil, and we didn't have enough budgets to drill and break 6 layers of concrete. And the soil quality also mattered. A lot of the soil in Dhaka has been is compacted garbage. It's construction materials, and just it's not soil. So I mean, even if you dig like 10 feet into the ground, or sorry, 10 meters into the ground, you will still find garbage. You'll still find polythene and waste materials. So when you ask me questions about how do we identify, like, it was really identifying these communities, these vulnerable hotspots. That wasn't hard. What was harder was to really you cannot isolate heat from the rest of the problems they're facing. So when you go in there, you have to take like an approach that, okay, heat is interconnected to so many issues. How do we, we can't reduce the temperature, but how do we make the foundational, the existing problems, how do we solve them a little bit so that maybe the effects on heat won't be so disastrous? So that's, well, while we co-designed the tree planting program with the women. So we worked with an organization called the Community Town Federation, which is kind of like a byproduct of one of UNDP's projects with Dhaka North. It's a project of livelihood improvement of urban poor communities. And through that, the CTA Foundation kind of rose, and it's kind of currently has 76,000 members of households who are all female. And they have elected leaders, and they have a very strong cluster system. I'm not describing it very well, but just for the sake of time, we worked with them, and through them, we worked with their families. And we learned a lot of lessons too. Like, we learned that next time we need to involve the children more so that they don't rip out the trees from the ground. We need to, do more in terms of improving the soil. But at the same time, while we were doing this, while we worked with the women to decide what species of trees we should plant, where we should plant them, we had these conversations about, okay, as I was saying, what are the existing challenges? A lot of women were like, my son, because my son keeps getting sick while going to school, because he can't cross the road where the school is like right there. He can't cross the road because these cars are coming in at such high speed. He has to travel like 20, 25 minutes, like this way and that way, and then cross the street at a safer area. But if there was a safety crossing right here, they wouldn't have that problem, because I am afraid of letting him cross the road this way, and kids have actually gotten hurt when they've tried to take a shortcut. So, and the shortcut also includes an overbridge, so it's actually through shade, but the cars are zooming. Another challenge was in another settlement where they've kind of, because they used to be like a settlement with a lot of access to the city, but slowly the surrounding areas got built up. So they got bought by other organizations who closed off their access. So now they're like in a little city-state situation with no accessibility outside into the city. If they want to go to school or go to the hospital, they have to take permission from the surrounding groups so that they can use the road, because the road doesn't belong to them. And there's a factory there, is a ceramic making factory, they don't get permission. So what that means is, which happened actually, somebody died and they couldn't use the road, and so the body started to rot overnight because there was no refrigeration, there was no mortuary or anything there. There was a case of a pregnant lady who, in another area, who it was so hot, she started having labor early, and she was not able to use the road in another area because the road was broken. So you can see how heat is like making all of these problems worse. So whatever capacity that I that I'm in, I'm a chief heat officer, but I have made it very clear to the city corporation that I will involve myself in whatever capacity is necessary to address these structural challenges, which works as a instrument of violence to trap these people in more and more systemic problems, to kind of put them back, instead of us all progressing towards health and well-being and living in dignity. Heat is kind of reversing that effect. And so that's how I have kind of, because heat is affecting these issues. So I've been working with engineers and I've been working with our city planners to install safety crossings, to install, tell these companies to allow them access. They shouldn't be walking 5 kilometers. By access, I mean they're not allowing any modes of transportation to come in. If they do want to leave that settlement, the one that I mentioned, they would have to walk. And if they want to come back, they would also have to walk uphill, and that's like 3 kilometers under the sun.
Yeah.
So the school children, when they're coming back from school, they actually had to walk 3 kilometers.
Dangerous. Yeah.
That's crazy. And so we have been working, so co-creating not just solutions directly affecting heat, but the structural layers that make the effects of heat much more worse. And also what Aditya said as well about the lack of awareness. So sensitizing not just the local government, but sensitizing this community, because again, we've grown up in, a lot of people are aware that heat is it's hot, it's too hot, my kids are getting sick, it's too hot. But at the same time, they're also, like, the adults in these communities are also saying, oh, we are more resilient than you are. We're tough people. We have been through so much worse. We have lived with heat all our lives. You are used to this. We've grown up in a hot and humid country. We've never been in an air conditioned. We've never lived in an air conditioner. We've never had these facilities. So we're tougher than you are. And, but at the same time, they're saying that, oh yes, I've gotten more sick. Oh yes, I haven't been able to go to work. So there is a bit of a cognitive dissonance here. And, it's a very, again, as I said, it's a sensitive issue. So how you go about it and how you kind of, raise that level of awareness is very important, and it's something that we're also discussing with community members and seeing what is the best way to achieve that. And I think the way you achieve that is having tons of conversations. There is no fast answer. Unfortunately, we do need to have faster solutions, but that would come at a cost of rejection to these new ideas. So you do have to take it, go at the pace at which they're ready for your information. They don't want to, there was another instance where I went into these places.
Can I catch up? No, it's okay. I do want to give Owen and Aditya also just speak, and then I will come back to you because we do want to learn more. But I'm terribly sorry for cutting you off. I'm just also looking at the time.
Sorry. Sorry.
No,
I think it's stop, like a buzzer or something.
No, it's easy on real life. I feel like I've been to events where they have like the 1 minute sign, but I can't flash that right now. So no, but really, thank you so much, because I think it's provided a lot of context, right, to our listeners about how multifaceted heat is and the kind of challenges we face. And I think when we think about it, you've touched upon housing and insecure tenure. You've talked about, transportation, access to basic services, water, school, all sorts of things, right? And it makes it very clear that we can't address heat in a silo, right? And it's not just like it's only about heat. We have to really think very structurally about how we're creating solutions that have long-term impact, especially for those who are most vulnerable, right? And so with that, I'd love to move over to Owen and talk to you a little bit about heat action planning and heat management strategies, right? In your introduction, Owen, you mentioned a little bit about how you're doing work on heat action planning, governance for heat. And given that you're working in cities around the world, right? You mentioned multiple continents, multiple cities, US, South America, Asia, probably, I think you mentioned South Africa also, if I'm not mistaken. So I feel like there are a lot of different places that you're working in. I'd love to learn a little bit more about some of the most effective heat management strategies that you've seen work. What kind of heat solutions have you seen work in unique contexts, and how can they be shared and contextualized, right? There's so much being done across cities around the world, but how do we pass lessons on, and how can city governments adapt them to their context?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I want to just start with the biggest picture, which I think Bushra just proved this case in point, is that one, appointing some kind of nodal officer or chief heat officer, someone to manage to be the champion of this issue in the way that Bushra is in Dhaka North is really important. And it's not just because it's someone who can be on the back end, kind of talking to different departments, talking to different sectors, talking to community members. It's also because it's someone who is incredible at spreading awareness about the topic. It's the person who the media goes to. It's the person who, when people are trying to figure out what the city is doing on the topic, then they can find the person who's kind of the focal point for all of it. But I'd also say that in many cases, when cities either don't have resources to appoint a chief heat officer, or it's, for various reasons, not the right fit for them, a task force of some kind can also be really effective. And that's not just because it's great to have a task force where people are coming together from different government departments and sitting down in a room and saying, okay, what are each of us doing on heat? How do we coordinate? This department actually isn't doing anything on heat at all and needs to be convinced that actually it's worth doing something about it. I want to give a specific example, which is from a city that I was talking to a few weeks ago, African city with a climate resilience department, and they were saying, we developed a task force for extreme heat that brought together a bunch of different government stakeholders. And the reason that this was effective was because when we, as the climate resilience team, went to these government departments and said, we think you should do A, B, and C, the response was essentially, we know our department best. Why would we go do those things? But when the ideas were coming organically from the government departments saying, okay, we could do this or we could do that, this is feasible, then it was a lot more likely to gain traction and actually stick. And so that can be the power of not only the chief heat officer role and the nodal officer role, but also of task forces that really bring people together in that way. So that's one around heat governance. And on the question of how can this be shared and localized, there are nodal officers, of course, in some Indian cities already, including Ahmedabad, who are responsible for the heat action plan. But I'd actually love to hear later in the conversation Aditya's thoughts on how that kind of role, with the difference between the city governance structure, the ULB structure in India versus other countries, how that kind of role might fit in India. So I might look to the expert on this topic on that one, but I'll give one more big picture heat management strategy, which is around understanding your risk and targeting your actions. Because even if you have the resources to expend, there's not much you can do without knowing where to put them, when to put them out. And so that's both the kind of temporal aspect and also location and which communities are most heat vulnerable. And so one example I'd give is that heat mortality and morbidity data can often be very, very difficult to acquire. They're either not collected at all, or if they are collected, sometimes they're very difficult to obtain because they're confidential and takes a very long time. Even in parts of the US where heat mortality and morbidity data have been acquired, it can be very difficult. So one thing that RSTROC has done in partnership with a few cities around the world is using all-cause mortality data. So this is when basically in a given day, how many people are dying in a city for any number of reasons. It can be heat, it can be traffic accidents, it can be bike accidents, it can be anything. And if you look at that data, but do a retrospective analysis of that data overlaid with, what was the temperature, what was the humidity, what was the wind speed, and a variety of other factors, you can use that to start to understand at a more, at a slightly rougher level, but still effective, what is the correlation between heat, humidity, a variety of other factors, climate, the acclimatization over the last 30 days, how hot and humid has it been, and start to use that to inform your actions. And so that's something that RSTROC has done in cities where it's harder to obtain heat mortality and morbidity data to be the basis of an early warning system that we've worked with local governments to pilot. And so that's one example I'd give of how do you operate in environments where heat-related morbidity data is really hard to acquire. And I think I'll actually leave it there. I know we're short on time, and I'll pass over to Aditya, or back to you, Ashali, for your next question.
Thanks, Owen. No, so I want to probe further, but I think I will stop and ask Aditya a question first, and then we can have a maybe more integrated discussion. I just also want to stop and tell all of our participants that we will soon open the floor to questions and answers if you have any. So if you'd like to ask any of the panelists a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box, and we'll get you in soon. But Aditya, I'd love to get back to you here, right? Owen made some really interesting points around governance, right? And other cities around the world have been able to integrate the chief heat officer, right, into their urban local bodies or into their no, Busha, don't worry, it's okay about time. So yeah, no, so you know, governance is a challenge, right, in the context of India. And last year, you published a really insightful assessment of heat action plans across India, right? And it became very clear very quickly that local governments need to be able to do much more to prepare and respond to heat waves and extreme heat, so that solutions are contextualized to local challenges, right? So I'd love to learn, you know, based on the research and the work that you've been doing, what are some of the challenges, governance challenges or not, other challenges, right? That kind of prohibit urban local bodies from really effectively managing extreme heat. And I think if you'd like to touch a little bit on financing in this question here, we can then segue into that and let Owen come in to talk about some of the insurance work. So I'm just thinking about how to flow the discussion as well. But you're on mute, Aditya. I can't hear you.
Of course, I'm on mute. No, I'll do the finance one second. But yeah, you know, Busha had some very evocative comments. And I think Owen was right in pointing out the chief heat officer question. And this is something that comes up a lot in the Indian heat governance context, especially with government officials. And you know, there's a group of people that think that, you know, chief heat officer is the answer, and there's another group that thinks that may not actually fly. My sense is it depends on two things. The first is the legal landscape in which the chief heat officer is embedded. Because the problem with the HAPs, and you know, the chief heat officer in a sense embodies the sort of political authority of the HAP, right? And the problem with the HAPs is they sort of float in the ether of government, right? They might be housed in one place, but then, you know, sometimes the people in the nodal department don't know a HAP. HAPs are heat action plans. And you know, they're called different things in different countries, heat plans, so on and so forth. But yeah, they sort of float in the ether, and sometimes, you know, there are cases where in some states we've sort of probed and asked disaster management officials if they have a HAP, and they're not entirely sure if they have one. Right, so grounding the HAPs within a regulatory structure and giving it weight is extremely important for anyone appointed to implement that HAP. One of the key problems we see across the climate governance landscape in India, this is true of the National Action Plan on Climate Change, and you know, national climate structures, state action plans, and definitely heat action plans. Anything that is multi-departmental coordination heavy becomes a massive problem in terms of convening and following up and monitoring, because the nodal authority for whatever that plan is doesn't actually have the authority to convene across, right? So I remember studying this now about 6-7 years ago. We were doing a paper on India's climate governance structure, and someone from a fairly senior ministry said, well, if I'm summoned by the environment ministry, you know, why would I go? Because there's a established hierarchy in government. Some ministries supersede others, and so heat is this sort of new kid on the block. No one really knows where to fit it. It doesn't sit within the constitutional structure, doesn't sit within the federal structure. So what do you make of it, right? The second big thing that will allow a chief heat officer to function is financing, right? And I mean, any position that handles a sum of money immediately has sway within the bureaucratic structure in India, and I think that's anywhere, right? So if there are powers through the regulatory mechanism, perhaps exists within, and secondly, if there's money that the chief heat officer is able to spend, you are more likely to have a functioning heat action plan, right? Now, coming to the specific question of money, and I'll just hand it over to Owen in about 30 seconds to a minute. It is very tricky because there is very little appetite for a new budgetary line on heat. And I think this is pretty universal, right? No one wants to say, and it comes back to Bushra's original challenge, right? Like, how do you integrate this with other existing challenges? You don't want to be the person saying, oh, you know, heat is a big problem, we need another $1 billion for this. There are a million crises at any given moment, right? And heat is just another one. So a lot of the financing then is about being clever enough to merge heat with what already exists, right? So we thought we'd undertake this exercise. And so what we did was we looked at India's centrally sponsored schemes, and that's a term of art for schemes that are funded by the national government but implemented by the states, and they work across all lines of social policy in this country, right? There are 66 of them, and it's about 10% of the budget. Now, the sense was that a lot of these are actually heat relevant. And we found that about 7 of them are actually hugely heat relevant, in the sense that if you can make the conversation about water about heat, if you can make the conversation about electricity grid upgrades about heat, right, about urban shade about heat, then you have a much better chance of getting this stuff funded. But someone at the local government level needs to make those connections and convert this, right? So Bushra's point was about alchemy in a way. So you take an existing governance problem, make it a heat problem, and then you make something happen. So that's actually one very important role chief heat officer can play for district officials and state officials. And I hand it over to Owen, who knows far more about the financial structures and so on. So I'll just hand it over.
Well, I want to check first, Shali, is that okay?
Yes,
To
that is
go
okay.
ahead. Okay.
That sounds good.
I just want to say a quick note. I mean, I can speak to the insurance side, but the insurance side is really a last ditch effort. Insurance shouldn't trigger until it's the worst case scenario. And even then, ideally should be linked into some kind of social protection scheme of some kind. But I think the bigger point that I want to make is that we're seeing, I think, over the last few years with the amount of heat-related crises that we've seen, a changing conversation, slowly changing, but starting to change around regional and multilateral development banks. And so this is obviously, you know, there are only so many, within each country, it will differ which sources of financing they can access, which banks, whether they can access MDB financing at all. But I think that a big part of this is the advocacy for those kinds of financial institutions to start putting more money into this and start recognizing this is a problem. And I think kind of behind the scenes, this is starting to change. And even not behind the scenes, we're starting to see some really great work from the Asian Development Bank on this in South Asia. We're starting to see other conversations from the World Bank on this topic. And so I just say advocacy and starting to really put pressure on financial institutions to do more on this is a big part of this as well.
Thanks, Owen. Bushra, I'd like to come to you and just talk a little bit about kind of mainstreaming your role. Yeah. Oh.
No, I was just like joking a little bit. I love
a little bit. No. But like maybe 2 to 3 minutes, right? I am actually just, as we speak, and I'm not the best multitasker, I was going to type it, but now I'll just say it. Since we don't have questions coming in, I'm just going to continue the conversation, right? And if questions come in, I'll take them as they come, right? So, Bushra, I think like the points that have come up about integrating finance within for heat, right? Kind of within urban budgets, right? You know, is that something that you've worked on as chief officer, right? How do you kind of, how is your role led to increase recognition, you know, of both heat, but also the need for like addressing these challenges, financing action on the ground? And, you know, what are your long-term goals for mainstreaming this position so that this work can really carry forward at scale? Sorry, big question, 2 minutes. Yeah, sorry about that.
We have been financing things until now is a couple of ways. So as Aditya said, incorporating heat into other existing projects. that I have done that a lot, whether it's like a road construction project that's going on. So, let's like one of the things that we are actually doing with that is there was a road construction project going on, and in that road, there was a bit of land that was treated like a garbage dump, like just a triangular piece. And so we decided that to just use some of that budget to do a pilot cooling zone. And with that, it's kind of like it's like a big sidewalk with seating, right? And the extra money that we would need to kind of put the zonal, so the DNCs, it's very complicated, honestly. It's just I feel like I want like more and more lessons. I need to be coached on government financing because it's so different than anything that I've known. There's zones, like DNCC is divided into 10 zones. And so the zone in which this is happening has some other budget from another fund that I am somehow able to use here with the existing budget for this project. And so since we are developing a cooling zone, there's trees involved, there's shade involved, there's ventilation involved. We're also trying to get a sponsorship for the maintenance of that project because historically projects are not maintained, even though maintenance is a clause, it's not really strongly enforced. So figuring out how to partner up with local community shopkeepers there to, paying them to maintain the place. Also, we're adding in, free, and because we are able to do that, because we are installing a free water accessibility station. So the person who sponsors that water is going to sponsor that entire area. So it's very messy, and it is very messy. And what I said, it's like, I'm as I was saying it, I was like, will anyone understand what I'm saying? But it is a very, right now, it's a very ad hoc situation. So whatever funds that you can find from whatever projects are currently ongoing or will happen, you kind of have to know, you have to increase, your own personal capacity to be all the time be aware of what are the existing projects that are going on and figure out how to integrate heat and all of that, and also outsource that level of awareness to the officials, the other officials, like telling them, hey, like we need to incorporate heat into all levels of planning. What are the existing projects that you're doing that we could do that? We could integrate heat planning into that. Certain challenges are there, of course, like I know the role of chief heat officer came up with Aditya and Owen, but as through my experience working in Dhaka, some people are very sensitized to climate change and the need to put in resources into it, and some people are just don't care. And so when there's a chief heat officer in the city, and also if this is this city of Dhaka, you have city corporation is the mandate of city corporations may be this much. There's other city stakeholders that are also that have a footprint in the city, whether it's roads or whether it's construction. And the city is not in charge of everything. The city isn't in charge of water. The city isn't in charge of gas and electricity and a lot of it. So we have all of these other actors in the field. And yet when heat goes up or when something happens, it's always the city corporation who has to answer to the public because they are the only ones, the mayor is the only one who's elected. None of the others are, right? And so it's really important when you're thinking of the role of the chief heat officer to be able to work within all of these different city stakeholders, and they need to be mandated to also include heat action planning within their own structures. Otherwise, it just isn't sustainable. It isn't sustainable if there's only one city, a stakeholder like the DNCC who's working on this, but the others aren't following, or there's still a lot of like unfit vehicles on the road, or there's still like on one side DNCC is advocating for conservation and then a whole swathe of trees are cut down in another road that DNCC had absolutely nothing to do with.
Yeah.
By DNCC, I mean the city corporation. Like, and for the climate action plan that was recently released, it was inaugurated. So the city of Dhaka has a climate action plan now, but I would say there's still gaps in this coordination between different stakeholders. And like implementation and governance, if we don't get these three things sorted, then, I am currently working on, like Owen said, ADB, we're working together on how to create a heat action plan that is inclusive and sustainable. We can't do that if we like if other city stakeholders aren't working with us, we can't do that without resources and team members, and that is a huge challenge, I think, within South Asian governments, because politics is involved. And, you know, maybe if we want to go for a depaving work where, you know, construction is, you know, we depave some of the roads, make sidewalks wider, include green, you know, include more tree planting. But, you know, there's a lot of political decisions that will not allow the city to take the right
That
action. So
immediately.
it's very complex, honestly, and it needs. And if we were to talk about this in full disclosure, it would need more time, like maybe hours and
Yeah.
days, to about all the issues that we are having to grapple with.
So I kind of want to poke a little bit further with a question that's come from anonymous attendee. Anonymous attendee has asked about the role of the private sector, right? So Bushra, you've talked a lot about different government actors, right? Whether it's the corporation, the departments that come under the corporation, or also maybe a public works department or an authority that's not directly linked to the corporation. And this is a question that's open for everyone. Bushra, I'm just pulling on what you just said and linking it to the question, but you know, what is the role of the private sector, right? Like when we think, I mean, some of the work that we are doing when we're thinking about green buildings, right? And green buildings and using local materials and thinking a little bit about indigenous architecture, right? What is the role of the private sector? They're building these buildings, right? It's not going to be, but there are green building codes and things that come in. So I'd love for everyone to kind of maybe respond just with a quick minute of, if you would like, on what the role of the private sector could be.
I'll just make it very fast. It's very interesting that you're mentioning this, because tomorrow we have a meeting with the central bank who is going to mobilize CSR funding from private commercial banks to fund an urban forest that we are planning currently. This forest is going to be located not on DNCC property, so DNCC does not have the authority to spend there, but we could enable and facilitate private companies to do that. What we are offering them is brand visibility in a way that is not advertising, but like, you know, kind of talking to the brand's promotion. It can't promote it like, you know, in that way, but we could say that this, you know, appeal to their CSR component. Brands also want to be known for their work in this field, and also future opportunities include carbon trading and, you know, carbon offsetting from their own carbon footprint. Even though that technology has not really taken off in Bangladesh yet, a lot of tech companies are interested in this. So, you know, we are currently doing feasibility reports to kind of showcase what their investment could mean in the future. And yeah, I think these are just two very important components. I'm sure the rest of you could chip in with more factors as well.
Sure. Owen, Aditya, would either of you like to respond?
Aditya, please go ahead.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I think anonymous attendee has raised a very important question here, because I'm sort of confused about this, to be honest, right? And there's a debate we've had within the last 24 hours in the office about the role of the private sector in heat. And to my mind, there's some sectors where you could turn a profit. The other sectors, private capital is going to stay completely away from. In the heat universe, right? And there's some sectors that by mandate, you could get the private sector involved in, right? So let me sort of, on the positive side, I think you were right, Ashali, to highlight buildings, because I think, especially the more you get headlines of 52.9 and so on and so forth, you can start marketing heat resilient buildings with low energy costs and high energy efficiency. And that can happen just through market dynamics, right? The electricity sector, you could actually get investments to improve heat resilience, because these outages aren't helping anyone politically or financially, especially if you aren't meeting peak demand, which is where you should be making the most money, and the country is transitioning towards a market-based electricity dispatch system. It just makes sense that you start covering the electricity sector. These two kind of work. Urban forests, we talked about carbon offsets. You know, it's very tricky territory. Who knows, right? Especially urban forestry. Let's see if we get the regular forestry right in the first place. Cooling R&D, that's a place where next generation ACs that are hugely energy efficient. That's a possibility. Especially if you have government incentives and subsidies, but also if you have government sticks, right? We currently have a voluntary 5-star, star rating system, which we've taken from California and then the US. That, if it moves to something slightly stricter, then you see private investments, right? So things like healthcare, tourism, agriculture, agriculture, possibly you might get a big like Monsanto type corporation saying, okay, here are heat resilient seeds, or you might get someone else saying stuff like that, possibly. That's probably still a while away, but things like healthcare and tourism, I think this is just going to be far more patchy, right? I think because this is where the state's going to have to step in with mandates. I think the conversation about, the private sector is going to lead the way, at least my sense is, and I think the way the private sector also thinks about, there's some areas where it will work, but in other areas, it's going to have to be state-led, right? So we have to coordinate that between state and private capital.
Thanks for
think
this,
that,
yeah.
can I
Go ahead,
just,
Rashad.
I think that we have seen a lot of private sectors kind of approach us. Like when I was appointed, I don't know what it's been like for you, but after I was appointed as CHO, there were just too many private organizations coming up to us, and they wanted to plant trees. They want, like, I want to give you 10 million trees. I want to give you, but there's, due to spatial restrictions, and also I learned this lesson later, that they just wanted to donate the trees. They didn't want to talk about what species they were going to give us. They didn't want to talk about like who will maintain them, whether or not DNCC has the resources to maintain them. So I think we have a long way to go from to like working efficiently when coming up with a system where they could work smoothly, but I think it differs from area to area and from country to country. But yeah, I think we're on the right track, but it's just about how do we improve the system and make it more sustainable for both. They always want it's either donation or like a business model. There, with donation comes the cost of the problem of maintenance, and with the business model, it's like, well, it maybe it's not going to be like a business model of where I can't give you economies of scale on it. So how am I going to, how do I turn this into a business model that you are benefited by? So I think that we need to have more conversations about this, but yeah, it's complicated. But it's a good start. I believe it is a good start that we see a lot of engagement, a lot of intention. It's just about finding the right vehicle to utilize those intentions in the best way. Yeah. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry about that. And before we kind of wrap things up, I'd love to know if you want to respond to the question of the role of the private sector. I know that Bushra and Aditya have kind of talked about the complicated ecosystem in the context of South Asian cities. And from what I'm hearing from Bushra, and actually I've also worked in Dhaka, so I know that there are a lot of similarities between the Indian governance structure and what's in Dhaka to some degree. But if you have other experiences from other cities around the world where private sector has played a role, it would be great to hear about them. If you have, I know we're over time, but if everyone doesn't mind staying for just 2-3 more minutes, it'd be great to get your thoughts and wrap up about that.
I think the Bushra and Aditya.
Sorry.
Oh, can you hear me?
No, so I was asking, can I add a question for Owen, which is,
Sure.
I'd really love to hear what he thinks about the future of insurance in this heat thing also, right? Like that in my mind is like the big private sector thing.
Yeah.
So adding that.
Well, I'd say on the insurance side, I think what we're seeing is that it's interesting to hear you say, and I think this is often true, that private sector leads the way, but I think in some cases it's very much the opposite. There are NGOs, there are governments that, in our case, NGOs that lead the way by introducing an idea, developing it with the private sector, often as a partner, seeking premium support from the private sector, but from the CSR side. And it's only once you get to a certain level of scale that the private sector actually comes in more thorough, more comprehensively, and actually develops a commercial product. And it's only possible to get the scale needed to make those small margins work. And so I think that's something that's being seen, not just with heat insurance. It's I think way too early to say. It's very early, but for other types of climate hazard insurance that have been used for much longer, I think that's something that the implementers or developers of those have struggled with. And so I think that's going to be the same issue with heat, except for that with heat, the question will continue being, as it already is, how do you successfully pair heat mitigation with the insurance product to prevent premiums from skyrocketing in the long term? And how do you make it not just something that, a well-off business can get heat insurance for, so that their operations can have a cover, versus limited in the resource, and they don't feel like they're spending their money on unnecessarily. And so I think the question is really one of, what's the right roadmap from this pilot that often NGOs are taking upon themselves to put into the world, then bringing in government, whether it's government support or larger philanthropic support to scale it, and then finally getting it to the point where you can actually bring in a commercial product that is effective and that kind of all parties can be happy with and see a stake in. It's one that we haven't answered for heat insurance because it's far too early, but I think we're going to be seeing that people tackle that question in the next few years. And I think we're already seeing major insurers get very interested in heat insurance, but they're still a bit wary about how to go about it in a way that's profitable. So that's, again, not a perfect answer to your question, but I hope at least a first stab at it.
And I'm just kind of thinking about the other role of the private sector outside of just insurance and the financial instruments, right, that are available to stepping that heat. Do you see in any kind of private-public partnerships in other cities that kind of enable the implementation of solutions? Alida and Bushra have both given a few examples, but any case studies from the cities you're working in?
I'm trying to think of a specific example from Miami-Dade County in Florida, but that's not a particularly relevant example here. And so I'm drawing a blank overall.
Okay,
so
no issues.
sorry to
I've put you on the
on
spot,
that
so no
front.
issues.
Other cities from Freetown, their urban forestry program, they worked with Green Stand. They tokenized the trees, each tree that they planted in Freetown's Freetown campaign. They tokenized them, and so the private sector were actually just buying. Each tree was kind of a token that they would buy, and the money would be used to fund community growers, and I think nurseries and maintenance. And I thought that was a very fantastic approach and made things so much easier, for companies looking to offset their carbon emissions. Apart from, sorry, I had to mention that because that was one of the first examples I learned about after becoming CHO. And I know that Bangladesh is, as we also proceed in that direction, it's something that, but as Aditya said, it's super tricky and it's still relatively very unknown in this part of the world. Although Singapore is doing a lot of work on this, but on the other hand, there are a lot of people who are experts on this. So I think it's also a question about bringing the right people and learning from them and figuring out a system that works. I have.
Go ahead.
Okay.
No, please. No. Please,
I wanted to mention in the wrap-up comments, if you'll allow me, 2 more minutes, but yeah.
Sure. As long as our other panelists don't mind, because I don't want to keep people. I think it'll be like 6:40, so it'll be 10 minutes over. So why don't you do that, and then I'll close. I'll let you. Yeah, that's good.
This doesn't have anything to do with the private sector, but I just wanted to also say that we did do a bit of successful, I would say, but it's still undergoing some work still. But we are in the process of collaborating from the city's end with the Met Office, with the National Met Office, which is under the Ministry of Defense, to incorporate early warning systems within our city structure. So essentially, they would, any kind of heat wave warning that they get, they would then send to the city's officials and the relevant officials in question. And that is the tricky part, knowing how to, what next after we receive the forecasting data, what do we do with that? So disseminating it in the right channel so that vulnerable communities, we do have a Department of Social Welfare that deals with the urban poor communities. So making sure that that message gets there, and also letting them know what should be done, like drinking more water, taking more rest. Like we are setting up those systems currently. We have an app, a city app that HEAT is being incorporated into. We have a booklet that we're publishing that contains all of these details and all of these guides. We came up with this design of a very small, a portable, compact hand fan that it was actually very Filipino designed, but it folds out into this bigger fan that has messages on HEAT written on it, HEAT safety written on it. So we are, this is all part of the HEAT awareness campaign within which the Met Office is helping us. And then there's another organization, I don't know if you've heard of it, it's RIMES, Regional Integrated Multi-Hazard Early Warning Systems. So they're also part of this MOU. It's a tripartite one. And just, it's in a very early stage. So we are working on how to do implementation and governance, just like I mentioned, but how to effectively get this early warning system infrastructure and use it to help the most vulnerable. I'm very excited about it. I just wanted to say, like, we're talking a lot of complications, but this is a piece of good news that I have as well.
No, thank you for sure. I think it's a great way to wrap up the conversation also with a piece of good news and a little bit of optimism and some solutions that are, being implemented in the city on the ground, and new ideas. I think it's been a really engaging conversation, talking about governance structures, innovative governance ideas, talking about solutions, talking about financing. I had a really nice time. I want to thank all of our panelists for staying 10 minutes longer than I had asked you all for, so thank you very much. And thank you for everyone who joined to listen in. We will be sharing a video recording of this probably later this week or early next week on our website. We'll also disseminate it via email with all the people who had joined. So thank you all very much, and yeah, have a great evening and stay cool as summer is hot.
Thank you, Ashali.
Thank you, Ashali. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Shelby. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.